At first glance, this logging steam locomotive train didn't seem unusual. It wasn't famous, it didn't crash, it didn't explode, and it didn't just haul timber out of the forest. In fact, wherever this locomotive went, the ground had to change. Hillsides were cut deeper, rail beds were widened, old grades were torn out and rebuilt. And in places where the forest had already been logged once before, that rebuilding disturbed something no one had planned to uncover. This is not a ghost story. This is a true, documented consequence of how logging railroads operated. By the late 1800s and early 1900s, logging railroads had become essential to industrial timber harvesting in Oregon, Washington, and Northern California. Before rail access, forests were largely unreachable, roads were primitive, rivers were seasonal, and timber could not be moved in volume. Logging railroads solved that problem. These were not permanent railways. They were temporary industrial systems, built quickly, used aggressively, and abandoned just as fast once the timber was gone. Rails were laid directly on rough ballast or wooden stringers. Grades were steep. Curves were tight. Safety margins were thin. And the steam locomotive trains running these lines were often operating at the edge of what the track could handle. Every logging railroad supported a chain of camps, bunkhouses, cook shacks, blacksmith sheds, all positioned to close close to the tracks. These camps were remote, poorly supplied, short-lived, and almost entirely undocumented. Logging was among the most dangerous occupations in North America at the time. Workers were crushed by falling timber, injured by steam machinery, thrown from rail cars, or killed by explosions and landslides. Medical care was minimal. Hospitals were distant, and when a worker died, the camp rarely had the means to transport a body long distances. As a result, burial near the camp was common practice. Graves were often dug quickly, marked with wood, and left without formal documentation. When a camp moved, which could happen in months, the graves stayed behind. Early logging lines were built for light locomotive trains, small geared engines. But as operations expanded, companies introduced heavier, more powerful locomotives to haul longer trains. Chief among them was the 3-truck Shay locomotive train, and occasionally 4-truck variants, designed to move massive timber loads up steep grades and over rough track. Unlike a conventional rod locomotive train, the Shay used geared drive systems that transmitted constant torque to every axle, distributing power efficiently, but exerting immense stress on the rails and roadbeds. A fully loaded 3-truck Shay could weigh over 100 tons, far more than the track and ballast had been designed to handle. The result? Rails spread, ties crushed, and entire grades slumped under the weight. Logging companies had no choice. To operate safely, they had to rebuild and regrade the railroads, widening cuts, deepening roadbeds, and straightening alignments, often cutting into land that had been untouched for decades. In this way, the Shay locomotive train became the catalyst for uncovering ground that had long been forgotten. Historical accounts, labor records, and later archaeological surveys confirm a pattern. When logging railroads were rebuilt or expanded, crews cut deeper into slopes. They widened the roadbed. They stripped away soil, and in the process, they sometimes encountered resistance that wasn't rock or roots. They encountered wood, iron, and bone. Not cemeteries, not marked burial grounds, but isolated graves and small clusters of burials, often located near old bunkhouse foundations, along abandoned rail grades, and on nearby hillsides. These discoveries typically included skeletal remains, coffin nails or wood fragments, personal items like boots or clothing, hardware. There were no headstones, no names, no company records to explain who they were. What was uncovered was not a single dramatic event, but evidence of multiple undocumented deaths spread across decades of logging activity. One of the most striking aspects of these discoveries is how little documentation exists. There are several reasons. First, logging camps were private industrial spaces. There was no regulatory body overseeing burial discoveries, and thus no requirement to report deaths unless they occurred in public settings. Second, many workers were migrant laborers. Their names were misspelled, their employment temporary, and their absence rarely questioned. Third, companies had incentives to minimize attention. Fatal accidents could slow operations or bring scrutiny. When remains were uncovered, the response was usually quiet, since there was little incentive to document it. As a result, many deaths simply vanished from the historical record. What remained were the graves, invisible until the land was disturbed again by the heavier locomotives. It's important to be precise. The logging steam locomotive train did not cause these deaths, and it did not intentionally uncover graves. But by demanding heavier track, stronger roadbeds, and wider cuts, the three-truck Shay forced the past back into view. Each rebuild of a logging railroad was effectively an unplanned excavation. When crews widened grades to accommodate these locomotives, they crossed paths with the physical evidence of earlier camps that had vanished without trace. In this sense, the Shay locomotive became the catalyst, exposing the hidden human cost of industrial logging. Ultimately, these discoveries were dealt with swiftly and efficiently. Work stopped temporarily. Supervisors were notified. The remains, they were handled quietly, often reburied nearby or relocated discreetly. There were rarely newspaper reports. There were no memorials, and there were no investigations. Logging operations resumed, the grade was finished, and the Shay rolled through.